Welcome to Worcester Voices, a series of conversations with people who live, work, study, and create in Worcester. I'm Beck Schutte, a student here at Holy Cross. Each episode, a student host will chat with someone who is connected to Worcester and learn what matters to them, whether it's a project they're building, a memory that has stayed with them, or an experience that has shaped the way they see the city. For our first episode, I'm joined by Mindy Marchand, Ph.D., a visiting assistant professor in the history department at Clark University, which is right here in Worcester. She's also my aunt. Mindy's research focuses on 19th and 20th century U.S. history, with an emphasis on women, public, and New England history. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really thrilled to be part of your inaugural episode of Worcester Voices, and it's such a great opportunity to have a conversation with you, Beck, about my work and our shared connection to Worcester.
Thank you. Our first question to start here is, I'd love to know your journey and if you could describe how you got into academia.
I had always wanted to be really involved in history from the time I was probably in middle school. But when I was in undergrad, I went to Syracuse University, and I dabbled in a lot of things from photojournalism to international relations. But I didn't major in history, although while I was there, I got more and more interested in the history courses I took, so that by the time I graduated, I was really interested in furthering my education and getting a Ph.D. in history and working as a professor. But at the time, I really just needed to find a job. So I did not continue with my graduate education at the time, but I did have my first job working experience right here in Worcester. So the job I landed was in financial services, and it was with a startup company at the time called 440 Financial Group. And we processed mutual fund transactions. And it was a great place. It was a really young and vibrant company, all recent college graduates. We had a lot of fun. And so that started a career for me in financial services. I left Worcester after about 3 years to take another job. And then I ended up working in Boston, really, in financial technology for another about 15 years. But I always had in the back of my mind the idea that when I could, I was going to go back to school and become a historian. And I had the opportunity to do that in the early 2000s. Things were changing in financial services, and my company was bought by a larger company, and it was just a great time to pivot. And so to circle right around, I actually came back to Worcester at that point in time and did my doctoral work at Clark University.
What brought you, I should say, back to Worcester for teaching?
Yeah, so Worcester, to me, is really interesting from that perspective because, I had known Worcester a little bit after undergraduate school, when I was working in financial services, but I really didn't know much else about the city. And so when I was exploring Ph.D. programs, at the time, I hadn't even heard of Clark University, even though I grew up, right outside of Boston. But in researching different Ph.D. programs, I had read a book called Home on the Rails about women in the 19th century in public domesticity, and it was written by a historian named Amy Richter, and she was at Clark University. And I was enthralled with her subject matter and how it connected to my interests, and I reached out to her to see if she was taking on new advisees, and she was. And so then I applied and was accepted to Clark University, and Amy Richter became my advisor. Sadly, she passed recently, just a few months ago, from ALS, but she was really a tremendous influence for my return to Worcester.
How has Worcester shaped your work, and how has your work shaped the way you see Worcester?
My work has really been shaped by all of the colleges and universities in the city. Because while I was working on my doctoral degree at Clark, I started also teaching as an adjunct professor. And I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to teach here at Holy Cross, for example. I taught at Worcester State University and at Assumption University and at Clark. And what was really amazing about that experience was the fact that it allowed me to really get to know different history departments, different types of student bodies, and those influences really shaped the way I think about teaching history. But at the same time, those institutions all have sort of a unique relationship with Worcester, right? Every college or university here has a different connection to the city in terms of the institution's history and the city's history. And so I really started to think a lot about how Worcester has such a varied history. And so when I started to teach full-time at Clark, I really wanted that to become part of my research agenda, was thinking about this real eclectic nature of Worcester's history and to really share that experience with my students.
Because you've had this history, pun intended, with Worcester and teaching at different colleges and universities, what is it like to conduct research in Worcester? And I'm sure throughout the years maybe you've come close or connected to different communities, archives, or libraries. So if you could talk about your research and interacting with various universities and parts of Worcester.
You know, Worcester is such an amazing city to do research in. You know, on the one hand, we have the really big institutions like the American Antiquarian Society, right? That's a fantastic place to do the kind of research that I do relative to the 19th century, for example. But we also have smaller archives like the Museum of Worcester's Library, and we have an amazing local history center at the Worcester Public Library. And the thing that I find most fascinating about doing research in these spaces in Worcester is how passionate people in Worcester are about the city's history. And, you know, the term that I would use is that this city is full of citizen historians, right? We have a lot of professional academic historians, but we also have hundreds of people who live or work or are connected with the city who go into these archives and they're doing research on their families, or they're doing research on their neighborhoods, they're doing research on issues. I feel like every time I go into the Museum of Worcester Library, it's full of people doing really, really cool and interesting individual research, and similarly at the public library. And I think that too has really informed my research, because I really want to emphasize history that is interesting and accessible and, you know, really available to everyone in the city.
And when you think about Worcester alongside these other cities, whether it's, well, Worcester is the second biggest city in New England, so, but I guess you could say when you think about the Northeast, New England, even the bigger America, what feels distinct and what feels similar about Worcester in comparison with these other cities or communities?
It's a great question, too. I think that,
Thank you.
You know, Worcester sometimes has a reputation of having a chip on its shoulder, right? Being sort of second to Boston. But I think, you know, in my own research into the 19th century, there are so many ways that the two cities were collaborative. For example, you know, I look a lot into, I do a lot of research into the lives of women who were activists in the 19th century. And they traveled between the two cities, and they saw the sort of, the ways that Worcester was superior to Boston in many ways, in terms of its ability to draw a crowd, for example, its ability to promote different issues that were important to the women, and Boston was not as strong in that regard. And so, you know, over time, the cities have really had histories that are shared in terms of activism and social movements and things like that, but they are still super distinct. You know, those are the two cities that I'm most familiar with from a research standpoint, and I think it is really interesting to think about their complementarity, but also the fact that Boston's history is really much more steeped in its maritime commercial history, and whereas Worcester, you know, we really think more about its industrial history, which I think goes a lot deeper in lots of different, you know, and eclectic ways, but that's really what sets the two apart.
From your perspective, what is one project that you've loved working on? If you could choose one of them, what would it be and why?
Oh, it's such a hard question. I have had the pleasure or the privilege, both really, of working on a lot of amazing public history projects in the last few years. And I have spent most of my time in the public history space, which really means just every way that we produce and consume history outside of academia, outside of the classroom. But one that comes to mind for me that is really fresh is a project that I did in two parts. One is a collaboration with Preservation Worcester, and the other part of it is a collaboration with a group of my Clark students. The idea with both Preservation Worcester and the Clark Student Project was to really highlight places in Maine South and their importance. For Preservation Worcester, there's a docent group there, right, of citizen historians who conduct research on different aspects of the built environment in Worcester, buildings, whether they're homes or factories. And so each docent will research a particular place and present to the community. And I joined the docent group last year and really wanted to research the Hammond organ reed factory. One, because I drive by it every day on my way to work. It's a building at the corner of May Street and Main Street. It's a 19th century factory building. And two, because with my Clark students, the other component of the project was that we were working on really understanding Maine South history, and students were putting together historic walking tours, and this building would be a really prominent part of a walking tour. So I started to research it. And the fascinating part of the story, or there's many fascinating parts, but one was that, when we think about Worcester's industrial heritage, we tend to think about wire, reeds, envelopes, the corset industry, right? But this factory turns out to have been really important because they produced brass reeds for organs, reed organs that were super popular with the middle class during the late 19th century. And the gentleman who was the owner of the factory, Andrew Hill Hammond, was a musician himself. So doing more research into him really brought together the idea of the sort of musical culture of Worcester with the manufacturing culture. His company ended up being the top producer of these brass organ reeds in the world at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. And it's interesting to think about the fact that was it because he was a musician that really allowed him to excel in this manufacturing space. Probing even deeper into the history, I learned that his wife, whose name was Rhoda Mariah, was also an accomplished musician. And it turns out that she was an accompanist for a lot of performers at Mechanics Hall. So starting, really uncovering this factory's industrial heritage led to these really cool connections between manufacturing in Worcester and Worcester's music culture. And I found that to be super interesting, and it was a great way to add sort of depth right to our understanding of this factory's history in Maine South. And so that's something that we use in our talks to the community, and the students have been able to pull some anecdotes out of that history for the walking tours as well.
With this history you bring up about, it seems like there's a lot of different intersections of class, music, factories, and even potentially women and women's rights and advocacy. What is one question maybe from that breadth of research or something completely different that you're questioning and you're hoping to pursue in the future?
That's such a great question, too. Thinking about all these different elements and the layers of history. And, what it brings me to a lot recently is thinking about how to sort of categorize these public history projects, right? And again, as I was saying, public history can mean any kind of historical project that's outside of academia. But to me, really, what's important and powerful is the way we engage the community and community partners in understanding these different layers of a community's history. And I really recently have been thinking about that in terms of this idea of creative placemaking. And creative placemaking is a term that's used by urban studies, it's used by architects, and it can be used by public historians. What it really brings to the table, and for me makes these projects so important, is that it's a focus on ways of elevating our understanding of a community's history, and visibly showcasing that, whether it's through, for example, public art, or whether it's through community events and activities, or whether it's through, reimagining other public spaces in ways that allow the community members to learn more about their history, to celebrate that history. And that has a way of fostering real strong cultural belonging for people in a community. And so it really can enhance the quality of life for people in a community. And so I like to think of that as I'm planning out and designing these projects as one of the overarching goals that really should come into play for anything that I'm doing with the community, is how can it achieve those ends.
What do you touched on it a bit, but what do you hope creative placemaking does for your students, the Worcester community? How do you hope people engage with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's lots of different, ways I hope people engage depending upon what the project is. But to give you an example, some of my students this fall did some work on a project that falls into this category of creative placemaking for the YWCA. The YWCA is doing a public art project on one of their exterior walls. It's going to be a wall of Worcester women, and it's going to feature painted portraits of 39 women from Worcester's history, from the deep past to the very recent, really some women who are really powerful influences in the community to the present. And so the idea is that, as people are approaching that wall, they will be able to see themselves, right, in some way, shape, or form, because the mural of 39 women is going to represent all different kinds of women who've contributed to the community. It should help create a sense of belonging for people. It should create a sense of empowerment for young women in particular in the community. And each of the portraits will have a QR code associated with it. So if people want to dive a little bit deeper and learn more about the women they're seeing featured on the wall, they can do that. And so again, the idea is to create this really sense of pride, right, in one's community and the heritage, the cultural heritage that has been part of creating and shaping the community.
In history, there's a power in naming and bringing or connecting one's identity or one's history with the history of others. So I think that's a really powerful part with the QR code, especially. In this project that you're doing with this wall in Worcester, are there any findings that you've come across that have changed the way you think about the history of Worcester?
I think with every project that I've worked on, there has been some element that has changed the way I think about Worcester. And I think what it really comes down to is that it's kind of like that old proverb or metaphor, whatever, about peeling the onion. Every project we uncover more and more layers of really fascinating and eclectic stories about Worcester and its residents over time, and there's always more to discover. And I think that's really what I've taken away from these projects.
And you mentioned earlier about the walking tours. So I'm interested in how that was created, how you created that, some experiences you've had while doing that. What it's been like for you.
Sure. I love walking tours. When I take a vacation, I love to go on a historic walking tour.
Okay.
And so I've always been fascinated with that as a way to really get that, bird's eye view of a community's past. So when I was developing a public history seminar for my Clark students, one of the things that was on my mind was developing a historic walking tour. And I thought it would be a really great way to accomplish a few things. One is to get my students off the campus, right at our colleges and universities here, there's a tendency to stay sort of, close to home on your campus. And I wanted to find ways of getting students out into the community and engage with the community and learn more about it. And then secondly, the very process of creating a walking tour allows students to develop so many really important skills, whether they want to be in public history or in other, forms of research, or even just general business skills, right? Students have to learn how to do property research. They have to learn how to do research on people. They have to learn how to create really engaging written content, and they have to practice their public speaking skills. And so all of these things together really felt like a compelling reason to start thinking about a historic walking tour. And so I collaborated with Preservation Worcester because one of their hallmarks is featuring walking tours during their Jane Week, which is a really important educational week where they host a lot of activities and tours and events in May. And so my students worked on developing a tour of the Main South neighborhood that connects to Clark for Jane Week several years ago. They worked in teams to research the houses and properties and individuals for about a dozen properties, and we mapped out the route, and we spent an entire semester doing all kinds of research, and we learned a tremendous amount about the community's history, about its change over time, about the challenges that it has faced, and the ways the community has been resilient and responded to challenges. And it was just a wonderful experience, so that now it's really become foundational to that seminar, and we also use our walking tours for other events and purposes as well.
And just so I'm getting the visual, on these walking tours, it's you with your students. Is there anyone else who is in addition to that, or is it what does that look like?
Yes, so they're open to the public for Preservation Worcester's Jane Week. So the students act as the docents. Okay. So there's probably, there can be as many as 12 students acting as docents, or there can be as few as 3 or 4. Community members register through Preservation Worcester. And I'm happy to say that we've had full tours every time we've offered them. Oh. And the route is about a mile-ish long, and it takes about an hour. And the students will stop at the particular properties that are featured on the tour and talk about the property's history, talk about the architecture to the degree that is an important part of the story, try to bring in as many stories of different people who have lived in the space, worked in the space, been connected to the space as possible. One of the things we've learned over time, that's really challenging is that a lot of the homes in that area are from the Gilded Age, late 19th century, where most of the records of the property are in the names of the men who owned them. And so it was really difficult for students to reconstruct stories that included the women and the servants and the communities of immigrants, right, who populated these homes over time. But they did an amazing job. And I think that's one of the hallmarks of the tour at this point, is it really serves as a way of sharing with the community the challenges of doing history, as well as the stories of the community that we are, ultimately able to pull together.
That type of history would be, I'm a sociology major, so, but it seems very ethnographic. Would that be the right term? Where you're getting involved with the community, you're enveloping.
Yeah, to a degree, if we were speaking, and when we speak with the community members, it does tend to have some, elements of ethnography. Mostly what we're doing in our research for the historic walking tours is archival research.
I see.
So we're not engaging directly with people except for their participation on the tour itself. Yeah.
I like that part about the participation, how Worcester residents can learn about the history in what can feel like an accurate and representative way versus the what you were getting at, the mass, I don't want to say masculinity, but the men owning homes and women kind of being written out of the history. So I think not only is it probably worthwhile for your students, but also the Worcester community more broadly.
Yeah, I think so too.
Do you have a favorite location or spot of conversation on these tours? Is there one that jumps out to you?
There's, the Hammond Reed factory is on that tour, which I already
Mm-hmm.
talked about. There's one story that my students were able to put together about one home on May Street that actually was owned for a time by a woman, Minnie McLaughlin. And she was a real rock star of the early 20th century because she not only owned her home, but she owned her own business. She had a laundry
Wow.
business,
Okay.
and she loved to travel around. And she was one of the few people to own a car in her day. And it seems as though she got into some shenanigans here and there, for lack of a different word.
Okay.
And so her story is really cool. But I think that always strikes me. But I think one of the great values of the tour that people do walk away with is the idea of how this community has really transformed over time from being a place that was dominated by industrialists,
Mm-hmm.
and men who were the property owners and who were the business owners, to one which has gone through a tremendous amount of adaptive reuse. There's lots of buildings serving different purposes these days. Some have been purchased by Clark for different purposes. Some have been bought by community development groups to rehabilitate and have been transformed into different kinds of living spaces for people and different nonprofit organizations. And so it's really cool to sort of lay out that story and how the community has changed and evolved with the time.
And when someone finishes the tour, the walking tour, whether it's a student or a member of the Worcester community, what do you hope they walk away with?
It's a great question. And what I've seen is that people walk away with different kinds of stories. Sometimes we give these tours to high school students, and they are really interested in the sort of social justice aspect of it in terms of how different properties have been reused for purposes that make them more accessible to diverse members of the community. Some people are really interested in the architecture. The neighborhood has some really cool Victorian architecture, and people like to see, the repetitive instances of Queen Anne architecture and then try to spot them themselves, as they go through the city. And so what I love about these tours is that there is kind of something for everyone to take away after they've completed the tour.
Worcester being a town of colleges and universities, how can these colleges and universities in Worcester, but also when you think about the as you say, the deep history of America, how can colleges and universities be more intentional with engaging and then also grappling with these histories?
This is such an important question, and I think about this a lot relative to our colleges and universities in Worcester. I think it's really, first of all, incumbent upon our universities to connect as deeply as possible with their communities and to collaborate with community partners on things that fall into that category I was talking about relative to creative placemaking, to really help create this shared sense of belonging for communities. And I think particularly here in Worcester, we're collaborating right now between Holy Cross and Clark, actually, between you and I. And I think there's so many wonderful opportunities for our colleges and the rest of the consortium to collaborate in this way to really help sort of celebrate and educate people about this amazing city that we live and work in.
What do you wish more people knew about Worcester as a city, whether currently or in history, historically?
Outside of Worcester, as we were talking about, people tend to think about Worcester as an industrial city, and that's really one of the keys to its unfolding history. And I would love for people outside of Worcester to have a greater understanding for Worcester's deeper and more eclectic history. One of the ways, that I think about because of my research in women's history is the many degrees to which women in Worcester were contributing locally and nationally to lots of different kinds of conversations. For people in Worcester, I would love for us to continue to do projects where we collaborate with community partners just to really keep peeling back that onion and hear more individual stories and hear more neighborhood stories and find more ways to really foreground those and make them front and center and visible as we're making our way through our city.
That was the last question I have for you. To our listeners, I hope you all leave this episode feeling a little more connected and maybe more curious as to who is in our community, as Mindy just said, and what matters to them. Community is something we create together when we stay curious, lead with compassion, and choose connection. And I'll ask, Mindy, do you have anything else you'd like to leave with or end on?
I love what you just ended our episode with. I think that's fantastic. And thanks again for having me.
Absolutely.